Hello, my friends. I am so sad that COVID-19 prevented me from joining you in person and live in Bangkok for this workshop. I looked so forward to trading ideas with you, to answering questions and hearing about the projects you're developing, and also to learn about examples that you've seen and heard of the transmedia stories you've encountered. It would be a fascinating exchange. Nonetheless, we have a video, so here we go. I'll see you on the other side. In this presentation, I will discuss 3 different origins of transmedia story worlds. First, I'll define native transmedia stories with some examples that illustrate the concept, as well as emergent and feral transmedia stories. And along the way, I'll describe what we can learn from stories that arise from each of these origins. Many scholars have described the internal structures of transmedia stories, made frameworks for them, and analyzed the economic forces and advantages of the form. The definition of transmedia storytelling can be quite simple. It is telling a story in multiple media forms and across multiple media channels in an expansive rather than redundant way. In 2009, Henry Jenkins broke the concise definition apart into 7 principles of transmedia storytelling, adding granularity to the idea of what goes on within a transmedia story. You are working with these principles as guidelines for your own transmedia designs, and they can be very effective for that. Your use of them for your projects in this workshop contributes to the refinement of these principles. I'm excited to see where you might take them next. In 2016, Jenkins also described differing contemporary logics, goals, and economic models, and tied them to global locations. He argued that culture and economics influence how a transmedia story is structured, from the media mix of Japan to Hollywood's mothership franchises, to New York's game-like experiences, Canada's ethos of public service, the European Union's effort at cultural enrichment, to Brazil's burgeoning hybrid of all of the above. Producers such as Robert Pratton, Andrea Phillips, and with this workshop, Sakul Srisaragam, have described how to create the network of stories that build transmedia worlds. However, none of them have yet examined how and from where a transmedia story originates. The focus of analysis are stories designed from the start as transmedia entities, as Jenkins describes as born transmedia. Is it a requirement, though, of a transmedia story to be designed as such from the start? If intentional design is a requirement, then transmedia stories could not have existed before the term was coined by Marcia Kinder in the 1990s. However, Oz and Middle-earth are common examples of transmedia story worlds that predate Kinder's identification of this structure. And Jenkins wrote of how the Christian story was told in the Middle Ages across books, architecture, sculpture, and ritual. This is evident in every religious and cultural mythology, from Christianity to Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam. If transmedia storytelling is thousands of years old, then where did those early story worlds come from? Who, if anyone, designed them? I argue that the origins of transmedia stories should be plotted somewhere on a spectrum of possibilities. On one end, I plot native transmedia stories. These are stories that are conceptualized as transmedia from the start by their producers. They are what Henry Jenkins described as born transmedia again. And they are the stories you're designing for this workshop. When you plan your story as a transmedia story, from the very beginning, you are designing a native transmedia story. But not all transmedia stories debut that way. Some of our favorites, as I'll describe shortly, begin as simple, single, monomedia stories, that soon gained so much traction with the public that their producers designed transmedia experiences around them. These are emergent transmedia stories. Further down this spectrum of continuity are the stories that are experienced by their fans, their believers, or their embracers as transmedia stories. These are feral transmedia stories, and they have no George Lucas, Disney Pixar, or anyone else particularly designing and guiding the transmedia nature of the experience. Instead, they are created by multitudes of amateurs, professionals, and fans, all spreading pieces of the story independently. Let's start with the most familiar idea, the native or intentionally designed transmedia stories. These might inhabit the narrowest range of the spectrum, but there is some bandwidth in there. Most native transmedia stories inevitably feature emergent elements not planned in the initial design. In taxonomy, a type specimen is the individual exemplar of a species. It is the reference point for how a category, like a biological species, is defined. If there is a type specimen of transmedia storytelling, it is the Matrix franchise. In his 2006 book, Convergence Culture, Jenkins illustrated his definition of transmedia storytelling through a detailed case study of the popular films and their pre-planned transmedia extensions. Matrix producer Joel Silver told Jenkins, "I remember on the plane ride back, Larry sat down with a yellow pad and kind of mapped out this scheme we would do, where we would have this movie and these video games and these animated stories, and they would all interact together." The Matrix was the first example of a planned and designed transmedia storytelling that Jenkins found. Not only does its story unfold across now 4 movies, but the story world is built further through a series of animated short films, video games, comic books, action figures, fan fiction, fan art, cosplay, and engagement is evident in the remix and parody of The Matrix. Far from being negative, that out-of-control fan attention is also a draw into the story world. As the old saying goes, no publicity is bad publicity. That doesn't mean that there weren't transmedia stories before The Matrix. There were. It's always been around in a feral way, such as most cultural and religious mythologies. The transmedia studies subdiscipline has spent a lot of time analyzing and critiquing productions like The Matrix, ones that are native transmedia stories. Other examples include Lego, who designed multiple native transmedia story worlds within their system of toy bricks. My favorite is the Ninjago story world because my son was 3 when it appeared. It is centered around the core media that Lego has, the Lego toy bricks themselves. But these toys, where the story is created in the minds of the kids building them, is supported through books, magazines, videos and TV series, console games, mobile games, and board games made with the Legos themselves. It's also an entire section of the Legoland theme park where you can inhabit the world and ride the dragons in immersive 3D. It was also a well-received movie. One might argue that all of this is only marketing, built with the intent to sell more ridiculously expensive bricks that you're going to step on in the middle of the night when you get up to get a glass of water. You might decide it is only to get your sugar-buzzed kids so hyped up about the products that they drag you to theaters and to Legoland too. It is. It's product marketing, just like the Marvel Cinematic Universe is product marketing. For some critics you'll read, that kills this transmedia story. I argue, however, that story is story for our purposes. Any story is still effective, no matter the financial or communicative aim of the project, if it tells a story across media in an expansive rather than redundant way. It is still transmedia storytelling. So, if we want to remove marketing from the equation, let's look at planned, socially concerned transmedia storytelling. The National Film Board of Canada's documentary High Rise project may center on online multimedia, but it also engaged the interested through lectures, newspaper collaborations, and actions on the street. One that I studied extensively was National Geographic's Future of Food project. In April 2014, the National Geographic Society launched an 8-month transmedia storytelling project on how we could feed 9 billion people by the year 2050. The project included stories in at least 2 of their magazines, on their Mammoth website, a mini-series on the National Geographic cable channel, an expansive series of blogs, a museum exhibition at their museum in Washington, D.C., mobile applications, 3 books, a lecture series, a hackathon trying to answer food-related world problems, food-related trips and travel for people who are interested in food and how it influences our lives, live culinary events where chefs cooked for people and told stories through flavors and smells and experience, behind-the-scenes looks at their work through blogs and social media posts that showed what they were up to, and they devoted much of their daily news feed on the web and in newsletters to food. They did this over 823 stories and 472 social media posts on 41 different media channels. Tomorrow, we'll discuss the bad side of all of that scale. The expansive, targeted, media-agnostic contemporary advertising campaign has long exemplified native transmedia publication. Advertising agencies have long known that they should reach different people on different channels with different messages. So have their nefarious evil twin, the disinformation campaign. Organizations out to communicate incorrect information about issues like our global pandemic use some of these same tactics. These projects spread modestly across the left end of this spectrum. Through their intentional design, all of the advantages of transmedia storytelling are possible. For good or for evil, the design gives producers the ability to better achieve their project goals. Not all successful, familiar, or beloved transmedia story worlds began with intentional design, however. The now almost 50-year-old Star Wars Galaxy started life as a single movie in 1977. Thanks to George Lucas's ability to hang on to key intellectual property rights and enormous public traction, that film soon became 3, then 6, then a seemingly unending stream, combined with novels, comic books, games, television shows, and committed fandom across generations. Emergent stories like this, that start as monomedia, but soon gain enough traction that producers then expand the story world, cover the broad middle of this spectrum. Like Star Wars, you could plot other story worlds, such as Frank L. Baum's Oz, from a movie you may have seen called The Wizard of Oz from 1936. The Wizarding World of Harry Potter, Disney Marvel's expansion of old comic books story worlds, to George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, which became enormously popular on streaming television a few years ago. Contemporary political campaigns around the world, which, though they are deeply designed, start from the candidate's pre-existing story. Contemporary political campaigns around the world, which, though they are deeply designed, start from the candidate's pre-existing story and constantly react to the feral mediascape to build a transmedia project of their own. This is also reflected in the spread of the fuzzy semi-design of fear and bias-driven misinformation, which simply emerges from our fears or our assumptions or things that scare us in the night. Again, these projects usually begin with a compelling story in a single media form and channel, and after they gain public traction, the owners of the intellectual property expand them into transmedia experiences. They emerge from a single story, but their variation puts them across wider bands of this spectrum. At the right end of this spectrum fall feral transmedia stories. These are the stories that gain so much public traction that the story worlds expand across media and assemble in the minds of believers, fans, or concerned citizens. These stories demonstrate all the principles, logics, locations, and dynamics of intentionally designed projects. These transmedia experiences are mostly seen in how we engage with breaking news stories. In this current moment of COVID-19, each of us assembles the story world of the pandemic independently and expansively through multiple media. We read newspapers, watch TV reports, and listen to radio broadcasts. We engage with social media. We converse at home or online. We jeer or applaud political actors. We, in the West, baked bread. We might sew masks for ourselves and our friends, or we simply walk around the community where permitted, among myriad other ways of gathering information we individually trust. Again, this becomes a transmedia project on its own, with no designer behind it. It just results in our own assembling of the story world in our minds independently. Feral transmedia stories have no single designer behind their structure. Story worlds are built through the independent contributions of many producers and many more fans. Like COVID-19, we can see these mediated experiences in the Me Too movement, a grassroots effort to call attention to sexual harassment and gender violence. It shows a mix of emergent and feral qualities. We see it in engaging or entertaining myths like the Bigfoot that stalks us for centuries, or the Yeti in the Himalaya. We also see this in the many additive appearances of vampire Count Dracula, launched and relaunched by multiple producers for 125 years. Or, likewise, in the enduring legend of Maynok. Despite the efforts of many of their leaders throughout history, the ongoing stories of the world's religions are fascinating feral transmedia stories that date back thousands of years. There are varying degrees of wildness in these feral stories. They spread toward the emergent in their varying degrees of domestication. This spectrum is valuable to the study of all transmedia stories, whether they come from the entertainment and advertising industries or from socially concerned communication. It is a helpful framework to understand the role of design in the expansion of a story world. In a nutshell, native transmedia stories start out that way. They are, as Jenkins describes, born transmedia. From the beginning, they have a designer with the outcome planned the way the Wachowskis did with The Matrix, the way you will with your workshop projects. Emergent transmedia stories start out as just a good story, like Maynok. But then, after enough traction builds, they evolve into internationally and intentionally designed transmedia stories. Think about Star Wars here, or Harry Potter, or Game of Thrones, and other big entities. But for the user, for us, the readers and viewers, it doesn't matter whether someone designed it as a transmedia story. If we interact with it as a transmedia story, it is a feral transmedia story. This categorization is not only useful for understanding how transmedia stories originate. understanding what makes a compelling story spread and assume resonance in our lives is invaluable for when we are designing our own projects. A successful transmedia always starts with the story. Although we will design a project to unfold across multiple media in an expansive way, we can't lose sight of the story itself. It is sometimes too easy to get lost in the process, the mechanics, and the networks, only to forget about what really matters. What is it about these immortal old stories? What helps keep them alive beyond their years and keep us interested in them? If we can adapt some of those qualities of story to the transmedia stories we create, even real-world stories that aspire to make society better, we will have much greater success with our designs. For example, there are many things about the story of Count Dracula that interest me as a storyteller. First, the original book is an epistolary novel. That means the story is told almost entirely through letters between characters. That leaves plenty of mysterious holes and allows for the reader to imagine what happens between the letters. We also read very few words from Dracula himself. He is mostly a third-person mystery. Author Bram Stoker allows us to imagine him, which makes him far more interesting and frightening. The story is also one of technology triumphing over evil and superstition. Dracula is ultimately foiled by high-speed communication tools like typewriters and telegraphs, fast transportation on trains, and the latest medical technique of 1895, blood transfusion. These aspects of the story made it feel immediate at the time the book was published, but the story has had multiple afterlives on stage, in cinema, television, and scores of other media for more than a century. In film, the mystery created by the epistolary novel form isn't very important. We still hear the multiple subjective views of the characters, but we see and hear from Dracula himself when he's on screen. The technology was also no longer new when the first films were made in the 1920s and 30s, and are instead charming and ancient in this most recent 2020 version of the story. In this new BBC adaptation, technology is no longer the savior and becomes the enemy. It is a tool for Dracula's evil plans. He uses a tablet computer to hire a lawyer. Instead of the original's Victorian excitement about the technology, this latest BBC series embraces our current fear of the harm technology might cause us. Although those aspects of the story make it contemporaneous, it is something more that makes this story live beyond the grave. Dracula is not simply fearsome and dangerous, he is also very attractive. We want to either be him or be seduced by him, even if that means death. He is the original bad boy boyfriend. This story engages our fears, our hopes in technology. It inhabits our dreams and nightmares, and it embraces innumerable cliches and tropes of storytelling. Those tropes, aspects of story we see repeated in many stories in many time periods, make the mysterious familiar and reduce the cognitive load of enjoying a story. Those tropes also allow us to experience Dracula outside of the core story in places like children's television shows, American breakfast cereal, games, cosplay, and much more. Dracula has also been satirized for almost a century. There is no better way to diminish the power of our fears than by poking fun at them. And perhaps the greatest effect of this transmedia story can be found in how many other vampire stories follow the rules and tropes of Dracula to define for us what a vampire is. Not all transmedia stories are fictional or about our nightmares. So how might we see these same things in real-world, feral transmedia stories? You can find the same aspects of technology, fear, and seductive abuse, overcoming evil or disaster, response to fear through humor, and multiple expansive retellings of the story in the feral transmedia story of COVID-19, the social movement of Me Too, or the breaking news disaster of the Indonesian tsunami. Here are those takeaways again. When we design a transmedia story, we are creating a native form. We plan most of the aspects from the beginning and carefully extend those stories as needed. But there is much to learn from the emergent and feral forms of transmedia that can influence our design. We must pay close attention to what makes a story interesting, compelling, timely, and popular enough for it to become a transmedia story through fan or public engagement. As you design, consider what tools you can make from how a popular story caught traction. Look back deeply, perhaps, at the story of Maynok, where it originated, what makes it so interesting and compelling, and how you can put those same qualities to work in the storytelling you do for your own transmedia projects. Since this is a recording, I can't answer questions and stop to hear your examples the way I would have liked to with this particular lecture. So if comments are enabled on this video, please leave comments with your questions, and particularly leave those examples I was excited to hear from you. I'll engage with them as soon as I can and as frequently as possible. If comments aren't enabled, that's okay too. My email address and other contact points are in the slides from the lecture in the video just back from where I'm talking now. So please reach out at any time, and I'd be happy to hear from you. I look forward to our next session and also to collaborations in the future. Thanks.